The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello, and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm Len Bier, and with me today is Jeanne Proust. Jeanne Proust has studied humanities, philosophy, and visual arts in Bordeaux, Berlin, and Paris. She has been teaching philosophy for the last 15 years in the U.S. and has held multiple leadership positions in ethics education and public philosophy. She currently serves as Vice President of the Public Philosophy Network, where she helps guide national initiatives connecting philosophy to public life, and as Academic Coordinator for Crown College at UC Santa Cruz, overseeing the core course on the ethical and societal implications of emerging technologies. She has been actively involved in the Center for Public Philosophy at UC Santa Cruz for the last 3 years, where she served as director from 2023 to 2024, spearheading community-centered ethics programs and partnerships across academia, civil society, and the arts. With the center, she helped launch the first Tech Ethics Bowl in the Bay Area, contributed to several Ethics Bowl programs targeting underserved communities, and led the inaugural Santa Cruz edition of The Night of Ideas in collaboration with the Mark Sanders Foundation, Humanities West, the Humanities Institute at UCSC, and Villa Albertine. She continues to serve as the program director for the Santa Cruz Night of Ideas, now a recurring event held every spring. Her PhD dissertation, which she earned at the Sorbonne, focused on the pathologies of willpower, both in philosophical and psychological perspectives. But her interests are wide. Among many fields, she does research in ethics, philosophy of technologies, bioethics, feminist theory, and aesthetics. She taught at different universities in New York, advocating for a widening of philosophical education beyond academia by leading and participating in different events open to the general public and to marginalized populations, including to inmates at Rikers Island and at San Quentin Prison. She gives many public talks, collaborates on podcast projects. She has a podcast called Can You Feel It? And regularly collaborates with artists on her photography, drawing, and painting works. Jeanne Proust has recently started her own philosophical counseling practice, open to individuals seeking to expand their worldview and to examine their values and life concerns through the lens of philosophical inquiry. Part of this work is conducted in partnership with the Philosophy Technologies Startup, which provides support for senior executives, helping leaders broaden their conceptual frameworks and decision-making practices. Jeanne Proust, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
So glad to be back, Len. Thank you for having me.
Yes, glad to have you back. And you have another Night of Ideas coming up on Friday, April 17th. And the theme this year, I understand, is Enlightenment Now.
That's right.
Yeah. So before I want to talk with you about Night of Ideas, but before we get into that, just to create some context, you've taught at the university level for many years. You also have worked with K through 12 students. You've worked with prison inmates, and you work with the general public. And I wondered if you could talk about why you think it's important to engage people outside of academia in philosophical inquiry.
That's a very fair question, and the very reason why I got interested in public philosophy in the first place. I really do believe that philosophy is not just something that you do in a classroom or during, conferences among peers who just have studied the same discipline than you did. So I think it's something that we do naturally. You talk to children, they have the most fascinating philosophical questions. you talk to many people around you who have no academic background whatsoever. They have philosophical questions about their life, but also in general about the nature of reality that are philosophical in nature. And so it is important to reconnect with that universal aspect of philosophical inquiry, I think. And so given that background of philosophy, which again started and took place in the public, if you think after all about Socrates, that's where it started. It is not in a classroom, during a seminar time. It is really just outside on the agora where people would meet and discuss philosophical questions. So I want to kind of like reconnect with that tradition, and that can take many, many forms. So the very definition of public philosophy can vary. I mean, it can be about bringing philosophical questions outside of the walls of academia. And what are those philosophical questions, could be discussed, right? But like fundamental questions, very general questions about all sorts of things, about existence, but also reality, epistemology, the nature of knowledge, etc. But it can also be, public philosophy can also be something like a practice that is directed towards more like activism, for instance. So where you actually do philosophy about things that matter to the public. So that has more kind of like a political then component that is also important and that I'm also interested in. So many reasons why I think we should definitely include the wider public into philosophical discussion, especially in a time like now where I think critical thinking is definitely something we lack more and more.
And it seems like it's a pretty natural social function that when we get together with people, especially those we've known a long time, we don't need to ask them, where are you from? Or, what's your favorite dish? We spend a lot of time sharing our personal philosophies about things, or or you could say reacting to the events around us based on our philosophical orientation. And the fact that you've done all this work around the ethics of technology, for example, this is something that's very much in the, a public concern right now, especially with this proliferation of what's being called artificial intelligence, which is really has multiple facets to it, of course. But with all of that, it seems like the ethics of technology is important. And as you said, it can be a political issue, like who decides what it's developed for and how it's developed is a question of power and politics as well. So it seems like it's very far-reaching. And I wondered, because I'm not trained in philosophy and have only touched on, this very surface of a few philosophers' writings, how does philosophy as a formal approach, what kind of tools does it give us to be able to look at broader issues and look at the context of our lives in a way that we might not otherwise do?
It's interesting that you use the word tools, and just to comment on the fact that you say you're not trained as a philosopher. I think the fact that you came to the last two nights of ideas, I believe, and you have this curiosity, and I think that's really what it's about. I think one of the reasons why I chose philosophy in the first place as a field of study was because I was curious. It is this curious about so many different things that I couldn't choose among these different things. And I just wanted to get into each and every single one of them with kind of a critical outlook. And so philosophy allowed me to do that. So the fact that you use the word tools, there are definitely a lot of reasons why philosophical tools can be definitely extremely useful. And we can speak about philosophy as a tool. I can go on for hours about how it helps you just, unpack the different, dimensions of a problem, how it also keeps you humble in regards to your ability to know something, how it makes you perhaps, suspect the kind of assumptions you might have about something. So really being careful about precipitated judgments about something. So it has many very useful facets. Yet I think philosophy also has something that or should be valued in the very fact that it is not only useful, it is not something that you're going to use, that you're going to instrumentalize necessarily. I think here, for instance, of the many public talks I gave about happiness when I used to give huge public talks in New York, where people would come and were just like, waiting for me to give them a recipe, right? And for happiness, like, how do I do that? What does philosophy say we should do in order to get happy? And I was like, well, that's not at all what philosophy does. Yes, some people have used philosophical, traditions in order to help practices such as philosophical counseling, for instance. You can think about Epicurean traditions, Stoicism as well, that can be indeed used in order to perhaps make you become a better person or feel better about yourself, right? But I think looking at philosophy as something useful, as a tool, misses a big point that is very important in my conception of philosophy as something that has to do really with almost a form of super spongious and passive contemplation. Passive is not exactly the adjective I want to use because you're very receptive, actively receptive when you contemplate. And so there is this aesthetic dimension of philosophy that I'm very attached to and that by definition is useless. And I think the uselessness of that is something that we tend to forget or undervalue today.
Yeah, and I like you mentioned that one of your motivations for going into it was curiosity. And there is that sense of wonder that I think we all experience. It's natural born to us when we're little. We have this sense of wonder and a sort of natural curiosity about everything. And that doesn't necessarily have to go away with time, although it's often, I'll say, discouraged or at least not nurtured in adults. But that sense, as you're saying, of contemplation, like to be, and you also mentioned to have the humility to look at things. I'm just touched by that, and so I'm kind of contemplating it in the moment. That you're talking about a position in the world which a lot of Eastern spiritual practices also try to approach. Of being in a space of non-judgment and of receptivity, to be able to experience both the mystery and the wonder of not just the world around you, but also your own existence and your own consciousness. And that seems like philosophy has fulfilled that in many ways in Western culture more. Of course, we can characterize everything as philosophy, it seems, but including Buddhism, for example, which is not Western. But I'm just, obviously I'm stumbling forward with this idea. But maybe you could help me clarify this, that when you think in terms of philosophy, not just as a tool for helping us understand things or answer questions that may be plaguing us, but also as a way to just experience being. And I wonder if you could talk about that some more.
So it's interesting because I'm actually prepping a talk at the moment for the Marine Philosophical Society. They asked me to talk about public philosophy as well, and I will be talking precisely about the type of examined life, to basically quote Socrates here. What type of examined life is really worth living? What do we mean by that? And I try to go beyond utility, beyond instrumentalization of philosophical tools to see why and how philosophy matters in I would say per se, right, in an absolute sense, without being serving to something. And it's interesting because at the same time I'm doing this public philosophy practice, which has to do with philosophical counseling, and so I get clients who come to me and really are looking for tools, and so I it's interestingly enough, even if I'm trained in the Western tradition and the continental tradition, I do have also to tackle indeed those Eastern tradition of receptivity, this sense of wonder you were talking about. And there is a lot to be found here that can both be useful in the sense of like, how do I apprehend my own life, right? But their very value is precisely or lies precisely in the fact that you should be able to detach yourself from this constant pressure to optimize, to be more productive, more efficient. And so seeing time as a resource that needs to be capitalized on all the time. So this is really something that we tend to forget about today, and that I think we need to reconnect with in order to remain just, sane. And so that's something that I encourage definitely in my philosophical counseling practice, but also in a new thing that I'm going to start launching actually in May, which are philosophical retreats, where I really want to create like a shared outdoor space where people can slow down precisely. So really have a kind of like experience a form of time that is precisely disconnected from this constant pressure to be updated, optimized, productive, right? So thinking together in a slow process about all sorts of questions. Sometimes we pick urgent questions that have to do with, say, you mentioned earlier, the ethics of new technology, emerging technologies, and the socio-psychological issues that it raises. Sometimes just fundamental questions that have been, asked for millennia, right? So the concept here is really to ask ourselves, okay, does it matter where you do philosophy? I think it does. I think where you do philosophy shapes how you do it. When you go in a seminar room, a lecture hall, it's not the same as when you go in a natural, low-tech environment. There is something that shifts here. People listen differently. They think differently, right? So I think that can actually deepen how we relate. That sense of attentiveness and conversation can be actually heightened in a very simple setting, in nature. So that's what I'm trying to do with those retreats, and I hope that I can just further that project of slowing time and trying to think in a non-instrumental way.
For listeners who may just be tuning in, my guest is Jeanne Proust. She is a professor of philosophy and has worked with the Center for Public Philosophy in the Santa Cruz area and has a philosophical counseling practice and is starting to offer philosophical retreats. The model you're talking about not being in a classroom setting, like being outside in nature, this is exactly what Socrates did, taught outside. And also I note that Yogananda, the Eastern spiritual teacher, set up a school in India where all the classrooms, if you want to call that, all the classes were taught outdoors. And he felt that was very important, that people be in the real world, a world of vitality and life, as opposed to being, inside some human constructed space. You also mentioned the idea of the retreats about time and about our perceptions of time. And that seems like a whole other possible subject here. But I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit about how you see the context of having retreats in a less formal space as being beneficial and different.
I think being outside really changes the tone of discussion. There is something less adversarial, less about just critiquing, each other for the own sake of like criticism. There is really about the dimension of also doing things together. So I'm thinking here about, part of the retreat is also about setting up tents and cooking meals together. So that tends to also flatten hierarchies, I think, and build a real sense of community that I really think is important. And so you spoke about Socrates, but Socrates was outside, but more in a urban setting, I would say. Whereas I feel more, I think this this endeavor is more likened to what Epicurus was trying to do in the garden, so really outside of the city walls as well, to precisely, and that's where I get to that gets me to the aspect of time. I think when you're outside in nature specifically, so far away from a urban center, you have the sun to look at. And I did notice that actually when I moved. I mean, I used to live in Brooklyn, New York, just, hustling and bustling. And here I am living on top of the mountains of Santa Cruz here. And let me tell you, my relationship to time has changed a lot. So, I wake up with the sun. Sometimes, I go to bed with the sun as well. I just don't look at time in the same way. And I tend to also kind of withdraw from this pressure again of, organizing my day in a very quantified manner where I need to know which hour it is dedicated to what. It's just, this is what I think nature can provide us, especially if you work outside, and I do tend to the land here a lot. You really get into another dimension of time. Time gets this elasticity that I had not necessarily anticipated, used as I was to the urban kind of, stressful environment that I had in New York.
Yeah, and especially I think New York is typifies that most time pressure, fast talking, fast moving, quick to react.
Yeah.
Kind of mode, and being out in nature, and I'm going to show some bias here, but particularly in a place like California or Santa Cruz County in particular, because of the climate and the environment, it's not about hurrying, and it's not about getting in as many words as possible into every minute. And you mentioned also in your philosophical counseling and also in, perhaps it's relevant to the retreats as well, the idea of an examined life. And, just to stray into the political situation right now, I just had a conversation with some friends very recently, and saying that all these people in the current presidential administration have unexamined lives. Like, this is how it appears. And I wondered if you could talk about, like you said, the feeling of community. Like, it's not just having conversations, but having meals together, experiencing the cycles of the day together, how there's a potential there to build community in a very organic way. And, and I wondered if you could talk about that building of community and about the idea of an examined life in that context.
Yeah, it's funny. I think you're mentioning something that I think I saw in the news about Andresen being proud about not examining his own life or something like that. I would need to check on that, but that was, I wouldn't say hilarious. It's pretty sad, but yeah. The examined life, it's an interesting phrase that we just, we don't really sometimes we don't always take the time to really look at. And when you look at it superficially, it gives an impression of just like an introspective kind of movement where you get to just know yourself, right? So you get to look inside, and you get to really think about yourself, for yourself, within yourself. The type of examined life that I want to kind of advocate for has to do with looking out of oneself. So the examined life here is not necessarily my own life, but it is about examining different opinions outside with others, discussing and examining ideas together that I think make that communal life way more interesting than just like looking kind of in an umbrellistic way or narcissistic way within. You know what I mean? So this is also something that has to do perhaps with one of the differences between philosophical counseling and therapy. A lot of people who come to me for philosophical counseling actually say that they gave up on therapy because precisely it felt that it was just making them look at their own navel. It was navel gazing. It was something about looking inside all the time, where really what they wanted to do is to feel that sense of curiosity and awe and wonder about what's outside, right? And so learning more, listening better to others and not to oneself necessarily. Now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't listen to yourself. I think it's very important to be able to have a, not only a kind way of listening to oneself, but also a very attentive way in general. But that's not where it stops. So the examined life for me is not about an individualized examined life. It is really about a shared examined life where we get to actually examine questions that are so fundamental to human existence together with others outside, right? So that's really what matters to me and what I try to do in those philosophical counseling, sessions that I hold, but also, I hope, in the philosophical retreats that I'm going to be organizing here.
Wonderful. I love that you make that distinction, because there is a leap from, looking at my life, what have I done, what decision did I make or whatever, or
right.
Who influenced me, to looking at life as a whole. And that, we tend to think of, we're looking at all of human life, which is vast, and we can never encompass it all in one person. But, you look at the history of our species, if you look at our presence in the world and the incredible variety and genius that we bring into life. But there's also even life beyond that. All the systems we're dependent on, all the other species we interact with, and not to mention the microbes inside our bodies and on our skins, and the creatures that we consume in order to stay alive. That life is a very extensive entity, if you want to call it a single entity. So I like that idea, to take that from just looking at my own personal inner workings to expanding beyond my own personal life to look at all of life. That's a very different framework.
Yeah.
And so the Night of Ideas, which is coming up on April 17th, the theme this year is Enlightenment Now. And I wondered if you could tell us, I guess, a little bit about the background. How did Night of Ideas get started? And I know you've included things like live music and participatory activities in the past, speakers who are not from philosophy discipline, but who have a very philosophical take on their particular subject areas, and there's a lot going on there, and I wonder if you could tell us how it came into being, and then what this year's particular theme is focusing on.
Sure. So the Night of Ideas only exists for a few years, but initially its ancestor was the Night of Philosophy. And that started, I think, 15 or 16 years ago. And I was actually there at the first Night of Philosophy in Paris at l'École Normale Supérieure, Ulm. So that was a very, I would say, sure, it was a public event, mind you, it was. And all the speakers were not philosophers. Yet it was still, it was not as interdisciplinary and not as arts-oriented and performance-oriented as it is today. So it was called the Night of Philosophy, and it was really mostly about, going around and choosing, one room where one talk would take place, or a panel, a workshop, very often led by a philosopher, etc. Then it became the Night of Philosophy and Ideas. So we started to slowly but surely get more interdisciplinary. And for the last, I forgot, but maybe 6 or 8 years, it's been the Night of Ideas. And so that's, that just like basically officializing the fact that now we're making it open to all sorts of discipline. And I have a background also in visual arts and in literature. And so for me, it's very important that philosophy actually gets into a dialogue with those disciplines as well. So I'm very glad that today we are just, seeing a lot of people who are just community voices, artists, performers. I try to choose people who are locals here to really just have some kind of bridge being built between the UC Santa Cruz campus, on top of that hill, which is, kind of metaphorically a bit problematic, and then the rest of the local communities, in downtown, in the center of Santa Cruz, they can communicate together during that event. That's really what I'm trying to do. So I'm pretty glad about the lineup we have this year. But yeah, that's the kind of story behind it. And I've been involved in Night of Ideas, previously Night of Philosophy and Ideas, for a long time. So from the first one in Paris to then all the years almost I lived in New York, and arriving here. Now I do give a few talks at the San Francisco Night of Ideas, and I organize the Night of Ideas here in Santa Cruz. So I think we have the smallest Night of Ideas in the entire international cohort of Night of Ideas, because it is, it's kind of, adapted to the scale of Santa Cruz. And it's at the Institute of the Arts and Sciences on the west side of town, which is a UC Santa Cruz building, but it is not on campus, and that's very important to precisely have that kind of event happening in town. And so I'm pretty excited about this year's program. I can tell you more later if you want. But you also asked me about the theme this year, right? So enlightenment. So it's kind of interesting. I think that the general international theme is actually enlightenment now, independence at 250. So that's the official theme. And that lands, shall I say, at a complicated time within, the context of US politics. So I chose to kind of twist a little, I chose to twist a little bit the title and say, and adopt enlightenment now with an exclamation point, kind of inviting people to think about what kind of enlightenment we actually want to promote. So the idea here for me in Santa Cruz is not just to celebrate, blindly the 250th anniversary of U.S. independence, but to explore the idea of the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment's legacy with a critical outlook. Because, it's kind of interesting. It made me think also about when I used to teach the Enlightenment in 11th grade back when I was in Miami. When we think about the Enlightenment, we think of reason, progress, universal rights. A lot of images immediately come to mind: light replacing darkness, reason overcoming superstition, knowledge kind of freeing us from ignorance, etc. Many of us were taught to see it that way. I certainly was. I grew up in France, in a culture deeply attached to the ideals of Les Lumières, the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment appeared as a kind of like intellectual sunrise when I grew up, and in the kind of program I had to teach up until 10 years ago. A moment where kind of humanity finally began to think and see things clearly, right? So I taught that story too, but, we can't just forget the tensions, the colonial and racist ideologies, the unfair distribution of freedom, the economic exploitation of land and people. And these questions feel very urgent today, and in the US in particular. I'm thinking, for instance, of, the movement, the Dark Enlightenment, which is this kind of neo-reactionary movement. And its influence is rising today within elite US technology and political circles. And that, originally, I think that movement was more of like a niche, anti-democratic, obscure, online subculture of sorts. And now its ideas have gained a lot of traction, increasingly, among Silicon Valley billionaires, Andreessen, for instance, and key figure within the MAGA movement. So that's something that we need to think about. And so that makes the question of, defining enlightenment particularly pressing, I think, today.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back with more conversation with Jeanne Proust right after this. Welcome back to Talk of the Bay. I'm Len B.A., and with me is Jeanne Proust. Jeanne Proust has been teaching philosophy for the last 15 years in the U.S. and has held multiple leadership positions in ethics education and public philosophy. She currently serves as vice president of the Public Philosophy Network, where she helps guide national initiatives connecting philosophy to public life. And she is the coordinator of the upcoming Night of Ideas, which will be taking place at the Institute of Arts and Sciences UCSC facility on the west side of Santa Cruz on April 17th from 5 to 9 p.m.
That's it.
Yeah. So, Jeanne, can you tell us a little bit about, do you have a lineup already set for Night of Ideas?
Yes, it is. So we are going to have quite an eclectic program. We're going to have Krista Berriesa with Beati Quorum and Sarah Cruz starting off the night with singing. So Krista actually leads a chorale and different singing projects here in the Bay Area. So that will start off the night. We also are going to have other performers like Alex Olwal with Alec, the flautist Juan with Olemano, who's going to come as well. Our keynote speaker is going to be Thomas Sage Pedersen, who is not a philosopher by training, but gives a lot of public talks already within the Santa Cruz area and beyond. In the philosophy kind of like microcosm, we will have Kyle Robertson, who you might have heard about, who also contributes a lot to the Center for Public Philosophy and has done a lot for the Ethics Bowl in the area. We're also going to have artists such as Ronaldo Wilson, Gina Athena Ulis, Libia Posada, people coming from Cabrillo College, Adela Najarro. We also have people from Berkeley, Iris Ovd, a dancer, Brigitte Wittmer, and some grad students who are invited also to come to present their work. We're in partnership with the Ripple Effect Arts Festival this year, and with some people you already mentioned, mostly here for this year, the Institute of the Arts and Sciences, obviously, which is the venue this year and has been for the last 3 years, the Humanities Institute, the Mark Sanders Foundation, Villa Albertine, and the Institut Français. So, as you said, Len, you're right. The event will happen on Friday, April 17, 5 to 9. There will be a food truck outside from 4 to 10 p.m. So don't worry, you will have food. And again, the address of the Institute of the Arts and Sciences is 100 Panetta Avenue on the west side of Santa Cruz. I have way more to say about enlightenment if you want me to do that.
Absolutely. I would love to have you say more about enlightenment.
Which is, again, the theme of this year's Night of Ideas internationally. And interestingly enough, I mentioned the kind of take I have on this theme for Santa Cruz. But San Francisco, where I'm also going to be giving a talk and actually leading a workshop and moderating a panel, the take that the idea that they had, the title that they chose for their event is Lighting the Way. So they really wanted to be very optimistic, more than critical, I would say. So I'll moderate a panel about virtual and augmented reality, but I also lead a workshop about the Enlightenment. And it's going to be called Bright Ideas, Dark Corners, Enlightenment Revisited. So I'll speak about the very promises of the Enlightenment that we talked about earlier: democracy, freedom of expression, scientific inquiry, public education, etc. And also about the fact that they were not evenly distributed, right? They coexisted with slavery, patriarchy, and just profound exclusions. So reason for a long time was often implicitly coded as male European property owning. And I think we're going back there also in a way with the MAGA movement. Even without talking about the Dark Enlightenment movement, I think we're going in a phase here, especially in US politics, where we're seeing that kind of movement again problematically contaminate the public discourse, right? So while philosophers at the time, but also today, spoke about freedom, entire economies were built on slavery, right, in the 18th century. While philosophers spoke about equality, colonial domination expanded. So I think it's not really a contradiction actually at the margin. It's something structural within the Enlightenment. That's why we need to question the very notion and concept of enlightenment in the first place. it's not just, it's not that the Enlightenment failed to include everyone. It often depended really on that very exclusion I mentioned. So that's why in SF, I'm going to try to discuss with people in a workshop kind of setting the boundaries of this universalist ideal that the Enlightenment seems to promote. So who was included? Who was excluded? And who paid then and pays now the price for what we call progress? So, if we look at the philosophers that we think about when we think about Enlightenment, so who do you have in mind, Len? Let's see if we think about the same people.
Yeah, and of course I think of, those who are referred to as the founding fathers, the people like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, these are the people who wrote, and we have a record of their thoughts. But I also think of people like Tom Paine, who was very much disillusioned with the movement for independence in the colonies and left. He left and he went and lived in France for a while, where he got involved in some of the early discussions, I think, that led to the revolution in France. So there's all these different trends, but there's also that side of that Enlightenment, I guess you could call it, which was very focused on economics and economic growth, and that notion of having the freedom, like no class restrictions on taking advantage of opportunities to profit. And it certainly makes sense in the historical context. You can see why people at that time, coming from their experience and background, would think that way. But that has shaped not just the United States, but basically, global capitalism ever since. And so it's, it obviously has a dark side.
It obviously does. I just want to suggest a reading here. I don't know if you heard about this book that just came out from Gregory O'Malley, The Escapes of David George. Gregory is a UC Santa Cruz professor, historian, and this book is absolutely amazing. So when you think about slavery, very often here in the US, you usually don't immediately picture the 18th century, right? Yet at the time of the revolution, during the colonial era, Gregory actually points out in his book that I think roughly like 1 in 6 people in the 13 colonies was enslaved. So that book brings to light like a really, I would say, largely untold story from that period, with, the exploration of the life of David George, a black man who pursued again and again and again the very freedom being proclaimed by the founding fathers that you are talking about, but denied to him, and so many others. And so at the end of a talk that he gave in downtown recently about that was basically launching the book, he talked about David George being potentially one of the founding fathers that we forgot about, that we should actually rehabilitate. And I found that very interesting. I wish that Gregory could come. Unfortunately, he's promoting his book internationally. I won't be able to be there. But that's a very interesting take on precisely the kind of legacy of the Enlightenment and how we can rethink about it. Now, it's funny that you thought about the founding fathers immediately as a reference for the Enlightenment, because for me, perhaps, because I'm a philosopher, and also perhaps because in France, the Enlightenment is also nicknamed the century of the philosophers. And we think about Rousseau, Voltaire, but also in Germany, Kant, Hume as well. It's really more this philosophical idea about dare to know, right? Which was Kant's motto, and a beautiful idea, dare to know. It's a way also of looking at Enlightenment as a form of maturity. That's kind of how Kant looked at it. And so the Enlightenment doesn't just describe a way of thinking, but it describes a way of growing up. And so again, we could ask ourselves, but who decides what maturity looks like, what growing up looks like? Who gets to decide what counts as knowledge, right? If you think about it, scientific reason, especially in the West, displaced other forms of knowing. I don't know, you can think about indigenous cosmologies, oral traditions, or more like kind of relational, embodied forms of knowledge, right? So there is also this kind of the dark side that is important. Now, to be fair, the Enlightenment matters deeply, and it's at the time it challenged absolute monarchy, it challenged religious dogma. So let's not, I don't want to paint the Enlightenment as something like exclusively negative. Of course, I think that it underpinned democratic critique, freedom of expression. It informed the language of human rights. So it even gives us, in a way, the tools to criticize the Enlightenment itself. And so that's something interesting to me. So contrary to like kind of a caricature that you have about the Enlightenment, a lot of thinkers were not blindly confident in reason. Think of David Hume, who questioned whether we can justify our belief in causality, right? Who said, well, we don't know if the sun is going to rise tomorrow. That's just, habit. Or Kant, who spent years analyzing the limits of human knowledge, asking us to be more humble with what we think we can know. So there is, in the Enlightenment itself, as a philosophy kind of movement, a deeply self-critical impulse. And perhaps that's where its most valuable legacy really lies. That's what I'm trying to say, I guess. So where does it leave us today? I'm not sure. Are we really living in the Enlightenment or in its crisis? As we discussed at the beginning of this discussion, Len, we're constantly told that we live in an age of innovation, acceleration, disruption, right? Yet a lot of people today don't feel necessarily enlightened. They don't even want to live an examined life, as you said. They feel more exhausted. They don't feel necessarily more knowledgeable, but more overwhelmed. And not necessarily more connected, but really more isolated, right? So what I'll suggest is that something has shifted also with the Enlightenment ideology in the way we understand freedom. The Enlightenment placed great emphasis on the idea of an autonomous individual, right? And that was necessary. That was a necessary correction from older forms of domination like absolute monarchy, etc. But over time, we kind of began to forget that we also are deeply interdependent. And the result of that kind of belief in autonomy and promotion of autonomy resulted in a form of hyper-individualism, a form of atomization, right? Where we exaggerated our separateness from others. And so in that world, I think that everything starts to look like a tool, to go back to what I was saying about instrumentalizing philosophy, right? Everything, every action we do, or every person we meet, how can they serve our interests, right? We start to think that way. And I think that's a problem. And I wonder if that's this kind of disease of modern life didn't come also in a way as a legacy of the Enlightenment, right? It's this way we have to look at everything as something to be optimized, right? Ourselves, our relationships, our time, our attention, right? We feel this constant pressure to justify what we do as if everything we do had to serve as a future benefit, right? So this logic, I see it everywhere, and I think we need to also think about that. So I could go on and on about, AI and, immersive virtual environments, which is something I'm going to be talking about as well in the San Francisco Night of Ideas. But we are entering a world where connection itself can be simulated, predicted, optimized, and that raises profound questions. What happens really to social bonds when otherness and others just become kind of optional? Real human relationships become optional, right? So that's something I'm really concerned about, and that I really will look forward to discuss.
And I wonder what kind of relationships develop when people are relating to a virtual entity that really has no particular needs or expectations or memories or anything. There's nothing there. It's just a representation of another person, and that, I think that's, to me, that's very concerning when I find out that a lot, especially younger people, and especially younger men particularly, are relying on these virtual entities for their social contact. And it's, to me, that's cringeworthy, to say the least. Well, I wanted to ask you a bit, just a step back. You've been involved in the Ethics Bowl program, and I wondered if you could talk about the Ethics Bowl, what it is, and about maybe a highlight of what you've witnessed for the participants in the Ethics Bowl.
Alors, it depends with whom you do Ethics Bowl. You could do Ethics Bowl with a lot of people, right? So most of the Ethics Bowl I've been volunteering for, thanks to Kyle Robertson, were mostly targeting high school students. But there is also this program that we run with the Center for Public Philosophy with San Quentin. And so now we're talking about adults who are incarcerated. So the Ethics Bowl can take many forms depending on who are the participants, I would say. But in all of these different forms, definitely the main idea, the most important idea is that it is not about the kind of like format of the traditional debate, which is about winning arguments, right? Regardless, you're basically, you have an agenda. You need to defend, that point of view in a debate. In an ethics bowl, not at all. What makes your rating better as an ethics bowl participant is actually showing that you're able to engage in a thoughtful reasoning dialogue, mutual understanding, where you listen to the objections of the opponent. Sometimes you're also, you end up agreeing with your opponent. So it's not so much about this kind of very frontal dichotomy that you will have in a debate, right? And so you also have Ethics Bowl organized, of course, with college students. And so that's the case actually with San Quentin, because we are with Mont Tamalpais College, which is the college within San Quentin walls, and we bring usually our UC Santa Cruz team there. So you could also do, I think the Ethics Bowl is such a beautiful project and something that should be really developed way beyond that kind of like high school or collegial kind of settings. I think it's something that should be taught in any kind of school from a pretty young age as really a civil practice of being able to listen to each other. So you basically, the way it works, you're analyzing a case. I don't know, it can be, let's take an example of surrogate mother or something like that. Okay, so you have a case here and the case is complex. It's not a clear, the people who are involved in that case don't necessarily do a wrong thing, but there is kind of like pros and cons that need to be weighed. And so people discuss about that. And again, it's not like one team is assigned one possible response. So you have to be, basically advocating for surrogacy, right? Or you have to be against surrogacy. So it's not like that. It's really, what do you think about it? And let's talk about it together. So you ask questions, you offer critique, you expand the discussion. And so the judges here are not here just to evaluate the content, but the clarity, the nuance, the responsiveness, and the respectfulness also of the exchange itself. So I think that kind of that intellectual humility that it encourages is something extremely important, where you acknowledge uncertainty, the multiplicity of perspectives. That is something very important, especially in a time where we think that there is only, one truth if you are in power to determine what this truth is, or where you just, notice a fragmentation of truth in so many different directions, right? So here it's about looking at truth as more of a process that can only be explored collectively. And so that's, I think, the power of the Ethics Bowl format. I mean, Kyle Robertson would say way better words than I am doing right now if he was interviewed. But I'm sure that, that gives an overview of what the principle is. So please start Ethics Bowl wherever and whenever you can, in any kind of setting possible.
Wonderful. Well, we're just about out of time. I want to remind listeners that the Night of Ideas is coming up at the Center for Arts and Sciences on the west side of Santa Cruz on April 17th, 5 to 9 p.m. That's a Friday. And I invite you, Jeanne, to share, is there a website or something like that people can go to for more information? And also, is there a source to look up information about your philosophical counseling and or retreats?
Well, thank you for asking. So, for the program of the Night of Ideas, you can either go to the venue's website and you will see in the upcoming events the Night of Ideas. You will see the full program there with also bios for each of the speakers and performers. Or you can go. So that would be the Institute of the Arts and Sciences website, which is also the venue. Or you can go on the Center for Public Philosophy website, and here again you will have one of the web pages about the Night of Ideas upcoming, and you will find the same kind of information with a lot of information about each and every one of our guests. In regards to the public philosophy endeavors that I am doing on my end outside of the Center of Public Philosophy for Public Philosophy. So what has to do with philosophical counseling or the philosophical retreats, you can just look on my website, just Jeanne Proust. You will find me pretty quickly there. Strangely enough, there is not a lot of people called Jeanne Proust except the mother of Marcel Proust out there. So that's fairly easy to find me. And no, strangely enough. And you can just find more information on there and just contact me directly. No problem.
Wonderful. Well, Jeanne Proust, it has been a delight again to have you on the program, and I look forward to catching you at a future event. And that's Night of Ideas coming up April 17th. Well worth a deep dive into it, a time of wonder and curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you.